Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief.
The understanding of Russia, which is broadly as Russia as a great power that has its own special path, that has a mission and that needs a strong state, and a different path to that of the West.
I think when you look at these other industries, what you find is that there's a lot of pain built up in different parts of the Russian economy. Some of it's only going to be felt over a longer period of time.
Baltic ways.
There were the countries that when the war started, they were willing to be, those voices of moral conscience.
The continent.
I think that this conflict today proves that we are able to go past grievances and that we are able to look into the future, into the common future together.
Report in short.
This is the real Achilles heel of Putin's mobilization.
And of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction.
These two countries are interacting militarily, or have been interacting in several different conflicts, and in some cases they're on the same side, and in some cases they're not.
New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Chain Reaction.
I need ammunition, not a ride. These words of Ukrainian President Zelensky in response to a U.S. offer to evacuate him from Kyiv in the hours after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine last February neatly encapsulate a common critique of U.S. policy toward Ukraine. In this critique, U.S. policy has been risk-averse and incremental. Instead of giving Ukraine what it needs to win and doing it quickly, the U.S. has doled out just enough, just fast enough, to keep Ukraine in the war. I'm your host, Bob Hamilton. In this version of Chain Reaction, we take on this critique of U.S. policy toward Ukraine. Is it a fair one? And if so, is incremental risk-averse policy a feature or a bug in the U.S. system? To debate these questions today, I'm joined by two people with great backgrounds in the U.S. national security policymaking system, Mr. Phil Wasielewski and Dr. Nick Gvosdev. Philip Wasielewski is a 2023 Templeton Fellow and a Senior Fellow in the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia program. He's a former paramilitary case officer who had a 31-year career in the Directorate of Operations of the Central Intelligence Agency. He was a member of the first CIA team into Afghanistan in 2001 and served a 3-year assignment on the National Security Council staff as the Director for Intelligence and Covert Action Program. His CIA career was paralleled by a concurrent 30-year Marine Corps career in both the active and reserve components as an infantry officer, including mobilizations for Afghanistan and Iraq. Philip Wasielewski graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in 1983 with a BA in International Relations and European History. He also has an MA from Harvard's Davis Center for Russian Studies and an MA in National Security Studies from the U.S. Army War College. Nikolas Gvosdev is the editor of Orbis, FPI's Journal of World Affairs, and a senior fellow in FPRI's Eurasia program. He is also a professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He was formerly the editor of the National Interest magazine and a senior fellow at the Nixon Center in Washington, D.C. Gvosdev received his doctorate from St. Anthony's College, Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. A frequent commentator on Russian and Eurasian affairs, his work has appeared in such outlets as Foreign Affairs, the Financial Times, the LA Times, and Orbis. He is the author of U.S. Foreign Policy and Defense Strategy, The Rise of an Incidental Superpower, and the co-author of Russian Foreign Policy, Vectors, Sectors, and Interests. Phil and Nick, thanks for joining me today on Chain Reaction. Phil, this discussion actually, the genesis of it was a discussion you and I had back in February in the FPRI event on the 1-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine, where you expressed a little frustration about sort of the reticence of the U.S. to give more capable systems to Ukraine early on, the risk aversion of our policy toward Ukraine, the incrementalism. And you and I got into a discussion about whether that was a feature of the U.S. policymaking system or a bug, whether it was something specific to Ukraine. So I want to start, Phil, by asking you that. Some of Ukraine's biggest proponents and some Ukrainians have criticized U.S. assistance as being too slow, too risk averse, and incremental. Is this a feature or a bug of the U.S. policymaking process? In other words, is this just the way we do these things, or is our Ukraine policy uniquely incremental, risk averse, and if so, why?
Well, thanks for the question. And I remember our conversation well. As a matter of fact, I think I expressed more than a little frustration at the delay. And the frustration was because, to answer your question, I see it as a bug and not as a feature. When in the past, when the administration has made it clear what its priorities were, the Pentagon has been able to quickly move arms across half the world when necessary. One example is the October 1973 war, when Nixon ordered a massive airlift of everything from Phantom jets to large amounts of ammunition to Israel, and a smaller but similarly quickly responsive effort was in 1982 during the Falklands War, when the British needed certain types of weapons, especially heat-seeking air-to-air missiles. So when the bureaucracy is energized, it can move. So I see this as a bug. Now, the question is why? And I don't think it's in the way the NSC system is set up itself. And I can go in later on into about this. But I think it is more about how the bureaucracy responds once the decision is made. And one of the things we should recall is that as early as March of last year, both Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin had made comments to the degree that, and I'll quote, "We want to see Russia weaken to a degree that it can't do the things that it's done invading Ukraine." And President Biden, it was unscripted, but it was from the heart. And you can imagine that this is where his real strategy lies, is that President Putin cannot remain in power. So that's a pretty clear strategic intent. What seems is that the bureaucracy, however, did not capture that and resorted to, I'd say, a combination of self-deterrence and inertia. And that is, I think, some of the reasons. I can go into detail a little bit later, but I'd like to hear your and Nick's opinions of why we have not seen up front a massive supply of arms to Ukraine. I'm talking about in the first half of 2022, and why now in the second half of 2023, we're just beginning to see F-16s and M1s being agreed upon to be sent, and they will probably not get to the battlefield towards the end of the year. So that's my short response to you. I believe it's a bug and not a feature, and it really depends on how well the commanders, to use a military term, the commander's intent is both communicated and then followed up on.
So thanks, Phil. Nick, let me turn to you. Feature or bug? And if it's a bug, why is it different this time in Ukraine than it's been in past crises of this type?
Well, I'll disagree with Phil, and to say from my perspective, I think it's a feature. And it's just simply part of a U.S. system which goes back to the Constitution itself, divided power. We don't like to do things quickly. Phil raised points that when we are energized, we are focused, we can act quickly. I would argue that those tend to be the exceptions rather than the rule. I think that Taiwan has raised some similar concerns over the years, as with Ukraine. Some of our other partners have raised concerns about the deliberative nature. And I think that in the case of Ukraine, I understand that, obviously from the perspective of the Ukrainians, it's too slow, it's too little. From the perspective of the U.S., though, the United States is a global power. We're trying to hold together a somewhat fractious coalition on this issue. We think of where the Europeans were in February of 2022, where we think of where our Asian partners were in February of 2022. The degree of unanimity that we have held together over the past year is remarkable. The fact that it has been slow, but yes, to have the Japanese for the first time and the Koreans indicate that Ukraine is not a European issue, but a global security issue that they're concerned with. The 180-degree reversal of the Germans on so many of these issues, from Nord Stream to actual provision of lethal equipment, and not just minor lethal equipment, but as Phil, as you've noted, Leopard tanks and other things like that. That may not have occurred if this had moved too quickly. And I think that was something that the Biden was weighing on the Biden administration. I think that your point about Biden speaking from the heart in terms of what his heart is telling him, but he's also been around the block for half a century. And I think his head was also telling him that perhaps moving slower, more deliberatively, but moving all together both within the U.S. government, the U.S. political establishment, and then with allies. Because again, the other point about the domestic side, sorry, let me just throw this in as well, it wasn't clear that the U.S. political establishment would be as united as it has been on this, that the American people, and more importantly, that Congress would continue to do this. So in some ways, again, from the Ukrainian perspective, too slow. From a U.S. perspective, I look at this and say this is remarkable, both from the broad question, but also from the perspective of relationship with Russia, with Ukraine, all the objections that were being raised in 2020, 2021, right up until the Russian invasion of 2022. So I think that it's a feature of the system, and maybe it's not a 3 cheers, but maybe it's a 1.5 cheers for a system that is working, and is working perhaps much more effectively than we might have thought it might have worked from where we were on February 21st of last year.
So, you bring up a good point about the administration having to hold together a fractious domestic coalition and a pretty broad, diverse international coalition, and to go slow but go together. Phil, are there, in the examples that you raised, 1973 and 1982, tell me if I'm wrong, it seems to me 73 is the more apt example, because then you did have a partner it was an existential fight for Israel. So was there a coalition to hold together in that case, or was it primarily just a U.S. effort to assist Israel quickly?
It was primarily a U.S. effort to assist Israel. And I think it's an example that when the chief executive, when the commander-in-chief makes a decision and is fully behind it, that the rest of the bureaucracy is going to get religion real quick. And I have to disagree with Nick on a number of things here. For example, the coalition, yes, it is a impressive coalition supporting Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's only a coalition mostly of the world's liberal democracies. A good number of the world, especially in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, is staying out of this. But that coalition actually has moved quicker to try and support Ukraine at the beginning than even the United States has. If you look at Poland wishing to send the MiG-29s over to Ukraine at the very beginning. The problem is that our allies, although they were quicker to respond or wanted to respond quicker, they did not have the capacity. Only the United States has the capacity of the arms and equipment, either on hand or in reserves, that could really provide the scale to turn the tide of battle. So I disagree with Nick on that point. I also disagree that in the U.S. perspective, it was good to go slow. I think from perspective our own interest is that going slow in incrementalism actually harms our strategic objectives. If we want to support Ukraine so that it wins, and we should probably talk about what is winning here in a second, then we should have gone out quicker and sooner out of the starting gate, so that we'd be in the Ukrainians would be even a better position now. Imagine, as I called for in some other writings, even before the war, if we had begun training Ukrainians on the Patriot system, on the M1s, on the F-16s, the position that Ukraine would be in now, and how many lives would have been saved, and how much less destruction possibly might have been done. So that is where I'm coming from on a disagreement with Nick, that actually we have moved slow, and I still say it's a bug in the system. It's not a feature, and what determines, I think, it's a matter of leadership, and it's also a matter of the president as the commander-in-chief and the secretary of defense taking hold of bureaucracy and directing it, rather than letting the bureaucracy from the bottom up try and drive this, which is the way I see it's been doing.
So, Phil, your view is it's a bug, not a feature, but zooming out a little bit from Ukraine to a more general description of the U.S. national security policymaking process, it's been described as producing lowest common denominator policy. So no one's first choice, but the only thing that everybody around the table can agree on. You've got some time in the NSC, Phil. Do you agree with this description? If so, why is this? Why do we do it this way? And are there advantages and disadvantages to this type of process versus a more streamlined process, or a process like you just characterized, where the national command authority, right, the president, the secretary of defense, secretary of state, make this a priority, and then the bureaucracy gets religion and reacts?
No, thanks for the question again. And I had the honor of being detailed at the NSC for almost 3 years, serving between two administrations. So I got to look at two different approaches to the National Security Council process. And it's not a matter of process, I believe, that holds things up. The process that is being used today is the same process that's been in place since approximately the early 1990s, when General Brent Scowcroft was in charge of the National Security Council. And how the National Security Council will work is there's a three-tier process of moving questions and problems, issues up towards the president for final NSC meeting and decision. You'll have the assistant secretary level. It's called various different things. A policy coordination meeting as council is what I'm used to. Then will come the deputies meetings, which is the deputies of the departments and agencies. The principals meetings, which will be chaired by the National Security Advisor, and then a full-fledged NSC meeting, which will be chaired by the president. This is a very good process, and it's proven that when used properly, especially with the NSC in the honest broker model, to look at pros and cons, risks versus gains, it gives the leadership a wide range of options to choose for, and also that the decisions can be made with clarity of what are the opportunities, what are the risks. However, once that decision is made, and here is my complaint, is that seems to be less follow-up. And in the Eisenhower NSC, there was actually a specific part of the NSC that was responsible for following up on the president's decision and reporting back to him on how it was doing. I think it might have been done in another administration or so, but it's not a rule. Instead, the risk is when you have this, what I'm talking about earlier about the bottom-up process, I don't call it the lowest common denominator factor. I would call it the sum of all fears factor. And here I'm quoting Churchill's famous quote when he said, "You can take the bravest soldier, the bravest sailor, and the bravest airman, put them in a room to advise me as prime minister, and what you get from their deliberations is the sum of all fears." And I think it's this fears of what might happen, which leads, is one of the prominent factors that leads to both risk aversion and self-deterrence, and maybe not a little bit of groupthink in there as well. So this is my concept of what might be wrong during the deliberations. I don't think it's process. I think it's part of leadership, and it's also not just the going up to the chain to make a decision, but once the decision is made, implementing it back down, realizing that there are real logistical and transportation realities we can talk about a little bit later. But that, in essence, is what my viewpoint is why we've had the slow roll in some cases of providing aid over the past now 16 months of this war.
So I think you're arguing, Phil, that we treated this as a normal sort of National Security Council decision, or normal national security or foreign policy decision handled through the committee system in the NSC, went up for presidential decision. Every time there was a major decision to be made vis-a-vis Ukraine, we use that process. And maybe I think you're arguing that we should have used a crisis process, not a normal day-to-day decision-making process. Nick, let me throw it over to you and ask, do you agree with that? Should we have gone into crisis mode very early on, or even before the Ukraine war started? As Phil said, should we have started training them on the more complex, more capable systems before the war started? Or do we handle it right as not day-to-day NSC decision-making, but by using the process instead of having it be a presidential-led decision-making process, a top-down process?
Yeah, well, a couple things there to unpack. And the first thing, and I think that Phil has noted this, there's process, but then there's personality and there's empowerment. You can have the best process and org chart in the world, but if you don't have people who are empowered, if you don't have responsibilities either delineated or people willing to accept responsibilities, the best process in the world will get you nowhere. And I think every time when we've seen policy failures in the U.S., it's less a process problem than it is a question of unwillingness to take steps, unwillingness to take risks or to bear the responsibilities. And that gets at the, is it the chair, is it how the chairs are set up, or it's who sits in the chairs that matters more. One thing I do think, though, going back to the Eisenhower period moving forward, that I think we have to address, because it adds to this complexity it adds to the slowing down is the number of people who are now invited in, the number of people who sit around the table. It was easier, I think, in some ways back in Eisenhower's day when, essentially it was the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State and the chairman. You had an NSC staff of 5 people. And it was designed, Phil, as you said, it was designed to, and you really get this from Andrew Goodpaster's memos, it was designed to do the follow-up. Hey, decision was taken. Where is the decision at? Now we have a situation where every executive department wants in on national security, tries to get in. We have assistant secretaries and deputies to the assistants all saying we all want to be in this meeting. And I think that has been the proliferation of the size of the national security staff, where at the end of the Obama years we were hitting 500 people attached to the NSC staff, and that just it makes it harder to have that rapid decision making, or it becomes easier. Well, I didn't get it in this meeting, let me continue to raise objections, or if I didn't get it in this venue, let me try in another venue. And some of that, I think, is the need to rein in the size, which started in the Trump years and has continued in the Biden years as well. Could we have started earlier? Should we have started earlier? The question there is the question of bandwidth. And this is another problem that I think we have to deal with, which is, and this gets back to empowerment and responsibilities, right? So we know, we talk in the literature, it's the rule of 10 and 50. The president can personally focus on about 10 critical issues at a time. That is devoting a lot of personal brain power. The principals can do another 50, and then the next sets have to delegate downward. But people have to have authority. They have to get, as Phil noted, they have to get those marching orders. They have to not just a vague commander's intent, but they've got to get marching orders. They've got to be given responsibility. And when we say about what were we doing, should we have been doing more with Ukraine when we knew that the Russians were building up? We were consumed, that the top levels were consumed by Afghanistan. That was the months of the Afghan debacle. And we did what we did not have was with this issue, with so many others. Phil, I think what would have mattered was we needed a point person on Ukraine who could say, I speak with the voice of the president. I have conferred with the president. This is what the president wants to see. And we cannot just keep calling in the president every time to have to say the president has to state this personally. I think the problem with Ukraine was I don't know who that point person was prior to February of 2022 that could say, I have this mandate, the president is clear on what he wants, and moving forward. And again, that gets back to the personality issue. It gets back to what does the national, if it's not the president, is it the vice president, is it the national security advisor? Should it have been the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense? But I think going back, one reason for the slow nature is the catch-up process of, we've got to get up to speed on this. And the intelligence community gave the warnings that this was going to be going down, but the policy process didn't take those warnings and turn them into these more actionable items, through the spring and summer of 2021 into the fall of 21 before Putin decided to commit in February of 22.
So, Nick, that's a great point. And I've said more than once that the declassification of what we knew about Russia's plans to invade is maybe, at least in my professional career, the intelligence community's greatest moment, right? And it may be actually that declassification order almost certainly came from the White House, because I think people in the intelligence community would never self-declassify things in the interest of an overarching national security goal. But your point is that the policy process didn't follow it, didn't take it seriously enough, or didn't kick into gear.
And I'd be interested in Phil's take on this. I also think that the brief in February and March was very much, and this may be, we talk about the Russian intelligence failure on Ukraine, which was colossal. But I think we had some setbacks because I think the president was briefed, and I don't know this for sure, but just when we look at the statements, I think the president and the team were sold on the sense that Russia couldn't sustain this and that sanctions would have much more of a devastating impact. You saw those comments in April of 2022. The Russians can't sustain this. They're running out of gas. This is all going to be done by the summer, which then gets to Phil's point about a bureaucracy that says, well, if this is going to be done by summer, we don't really want to have to shift gears. It's a lot of, we don't want to take resources away from other projects that are more important to us. And when you had that famous line, the Russians are going to run out of everything by the end of April 2022, I think that's where Phil, I don't think it was necessarily a malicious, say, anti-Ukrainian bias in the bureaucracy. I think it was this sense that the Russians are going to run out of gas, and then we can just go back to doing what we were planning to do no matter what. But that goes back to your point about the intelligence. The intelligence is there, but the handoff from intelligence to that being, here are the policy prescriptions that you need. We have a gap here, and the question will be, as always happens in Washington, sooner or later, more of the leaks, the memoirs start to write, the finger pointing begins. Bob Woodward is called to midnight meetings to be told who really was at fault, and then we'll get more of that picture. But I think that is a great point that you've raised, that the intelligence community, we saw the revolver, we saw the finger on the trigger, we saw the finger beginning to crook on the trigger, and then to say, over to you, the gun's about to fire, and then someone saying, I don't know, maybe the gun's not loaded, or it's not really going to happen. So the policy, I think, as Phil has been saying, this comes back to the policy side.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Phil, let me ask you any reaction to that, and then I want to look into the future a little bit.
Well, my primary reaction is the first part about Nick was saying is I'm in total agreement regarding personnel being policy, and that is the key. The second part regarding bandwidth and a few other things, and if there's time, I also want to talk about NSC size, which I don't think is really the problem per se. And also, there's another side to the intelligence assessment that we do need to talk about. Regarding bandwidth, by November of 21, when this was really beginning to pick up steam and was becoming open source information, Afghanistan had been done with. So although we were still dealing with the refugees and that, the major debacle of what it had been was over. And this certainly was one of the top 10 things that the president had time to cover. So I don't think it was much of a bandwidth issue. I think there was part of the problem was the intelligence, not that the attack was coming. Again, just quoting from open sources, November, December of 2021, early 2022, we were having open source information being either leaked or just briefed from the National Security Council that the United States believed that an attack was coming. Part of the problem is that the Ukrainians didn't believe it. And we did not take some of the appropriate steps that they needed to take. So, there's poor intelligence assessment in some ways on all sides of this, the Russians, the Ukrainians, and Americans. And that's just part of the intelligence work. But although there's part of indications and warnings, and the warning part was done right, but there was also an assessment of military capability, which was horrible. It did not give the Ukrainians agency of being able to defend themselves, and it gave the Russians too much credit for what they'd be able to achieve. So therefore, administration policy was preparing for a guerrilla war in a predominantly Russian-occupied Ukraine, and to evacuate President Zelensky as his first thing coming on up. When you're thinking about those sorts of things, you're not thinking about the long fight of preparing people on M1 and Patriot, systems. So I think in that way, the intelligence assessment of capabilities of both the Ukrainians to defend and the Russians to attack was badly skewed. Now, we also saw this in open source of people writing just before in the New York Times that the Russians were going to unleash their own version of shock and awe. They did. It was just on themselves. So that is my kind of response to Nick on regarding this. So I don't think it was so much a bandwidth issue. And just one aside on NSC size, I have to put this out. I've seen the complaints of the NSC, the size issue, and there can be valid criticism on this, but I think it's a little bit too much overdone. When you're counting the numbers, what most people are doing is they're throwing in the White House Situation Room numbers, which is part of the NSC, but is run 24/7, 365, 366 on leap years. That's a large amount of people doing shift work, very good people, but there's a lot there. There's the IT folks, there's the security folks, there is the press, there is a number of other ancillary but essential functions that are served. All of these serve, and the NSC staff, the executive office, president, When you get down to the directors and the senior directors who are preparing the policy papers and preparing the paperwork for these meetings that happen and coordinating everything, you are in single digits. In my time, the Asia Directorate I could count the number of people covering, the world's largest populated continent on one hand and a couple of fingers on the other. My own directorate had only 6 people, and I worked usually 12-hour days, if not more. If anything, an argument could be made that a few more people on the staff would actually, as far as director, senior director level, would actually help rather than hinder. So this is something, my own experience, I really didn't see as too much of a problem as far as it being too large for what we asked the NSC to do, which is far different, as Nick has properly pointed out, than what it was expected to do under Eisenhower. And the amount of topics that it's asked to focus on in what is now considered national defense, which goes even beyond some elements of just interstate competition, but broad things as well. There are sections dealing with everything from human rights to Ebola task force came from the NSC in most part during the Obama administration. It's at least a good part of its support and membership. So these things, when you talk about size, I hope people take into consideration. But to conclude, I think, as before, that any issues are about leadership and personnel as opposed to procedures, both for the good and for the bad. As Nick properly pointed out, you can have the best line diagrams and the best procedural standard operating procedures, but if you don't have the right people, or if you don't have people who are decisive, it may not help.
Great. Thanks, Phil. So before we move forward, at least 2 new ideas for chain reaction podcasts have popped into my head listening to you guys talk. One is this natural tension between the intelligence community and the policy community. The question being, why do intelligence professionals and policymakers so often clash, or why do they speak past each other? So maybe in a future one, we'll get into that. And then the other one is this: what's the proper role of the NSC versus the role of the state and defense departments in making foreign and national security policy, right? All of my career actually has been in the Defense Department, and there's a natural aversion in the DoD to a large activist NSC, because the idea is that's the prerogative of the Department of Defense, working with the Department of State to make foreign and national security policy. So again, something for a future podcast. But let me look forward here. And we've said that the goal is to give Ukraine everything it needs to win. So what is that? And what does winning mean? Let me start with you, Nick, and then we'll come back to Phil to wrap it up.
Yeah, I mean, the problem here is, that ultimate definition, because it gets exactly to what Phil has been saying in terms of the types of support and equipment that you're providing. Is what does it mean to win? And when we look at the U.S. over the last year, we've seen an evolution or a meandering of those goals, and it has gone from, we defined winning last year when we thought the Russians were going to steamroll over eastern and central Ukraine. We were going to pull Zelensky and his cabinet out to the west or to Poland. We defined winning as anything that prevented the collapse of Ukraine as a state as the goal. Since then, and then after the Ukrainian counteroffensives of the summer and fall, we've seen, is winning getting Ukraine back to status quo ante February of 2022? Is winning getting Ukraine back to its internationally recognized borders as it was prior to 2014? And is winning also about, and Phil noted the comments that Secretary Austin made, that it's not just about Ukraine winning, but that changes in Russia's ability to generate and project power. Do we want, are we going to have a victory condition that says Russia needs to give up or be deprived of certain things? The other question that's hanging over us, that's tied to this question of winning, is Ukraine beyond the aspirational statements from Bucharest in 2008? Is there a timetable for Ukrainian membership in NATO? How quickly? And is that tied to Ukraine has to control all of its territory? It has to control most of it. And between membership in NATO and the run-up to that, what sort of security guarantees and the like? So the problem, I think, now is I don't know, and I don't have a sense from the United States itself, and then, of course, across this coalition, that we we have an agreed understanding of what winning means. You hear winning is everything but Crimea, everything is everything taken back, including Crimea. Winning is President Putin is no longer in office. As long as he stays in office, then that's not winning. And sometimes strategic ambiguity has a purpose, but really with the run-up, as we're moving closer to the Vilnius summit, some of these questions are going to have to be answered. If we get, again, as we had in Bucharest in 2008, a sense that, well, until the territorial issues are resolved, we can't move forward on NATO membership, then that's going to have a real implication on Ukraine's future security. It also has implications, I think, as Phil has said before, about what we should have been preparing to give and how quickly and how much we're going to sustain that for the future. So I think there is ambiguity about what winning is, and I think the longer that goes on, that ambiguity actually is, to use your framing from the beginning, that becomes a bug, not a feature.
Okay, Phil, over to you. Bring us home. What does Ukrainian victory look like, and what do they need to achieve it?
The Ukrainians, the victory looks like this: the return of its internationally recognized borders of 1991. Question is, what is the U.S. national security goal for this? And Nick has been stressing particularly strongly the issue of ambiguity, and it's right to do so because this is an area where I believe we should not have some. And one of the reasons I think we have this is, although President Biden made some comments from the heart in early 2022, he's yet to address the country on exactly what is our national security interest in Ukraine, which I think would be excellent to do, both for rallying domestic support for our efforts there in helping this country, but understanding why we are making the investment that we are and what is in it for us. And I would say what is in it for us is also Ukraine's recovering its territory to its recognized borders in 1991 so that it can join NATO to prevent this from happening again. And this is in our interest for several reasons. You can talk about the rules-based order and the need for that and protecting it. But this would set Russia back for decades and possibly stir internal changes after such a major defeat as has happened other times in Russian history. What it would also do is it would remove for at least a decade or more the threat that Russia could pose to our interest in Europe, and therefore allow us to turn much of this over to the Europeans and to galvanize them into doing so that we can turn our security interests more over to East Asia, which requires, in some ways, different types of defense investments, different types of weapon systems, and that to protect our interests there. So there is what the Ukrainians have done so far has greatly helped our own national security. We need to be able to make sure that they can complete that. It's in their interest and it's in our interest. It's in our interest both on the continent in Europe, but it's also in our interest in the continent of Asia. So that's my thoughts on what what would help us in our own discussions on national security regarding ambiguity and why it continues to be within our interest to support the Ukraine.
Nick, any final comment to anything to what Phil just said or anything we've talked about?
I think Phil's point that at some point President needs to make the case directly to the American people, laying out why this matters, making the doorstep case to the American people is going to be critical, because that's also part of the long-term sustainability of the strategy. Because the other piece of this is, I think there is a popular mood, a sense that Ukraine has a major military victory. We're done. We move on. Ukraine is going to need not just security assistance, but a lot of reconstruction assistance. Whatever is confiscated from, frozen Russian accounts is not going to be enough. That's going to require that long-term political commitment. And again, we come back to the politics of this. So it's time for the president to make that case, and for his senior people to be able to make that case. And but again, for the president, because even senior officials cannot make the case if the president himself is not laying it out, and then laying it in context of this strategic shift to the Indo-Pacific, and for the Europeans in particular to be put on final notice that we need them to do more for their security in their part of the world, because the global balance of power in favor of the liberal democracies has been eroding and we're going to need to be able to focus in other parts of the world much more extensively. So maybe that it's getting close for that prime time address from the president to make this case, to make it clear, and then in turn, going back to what Phil said earlier, once you have that level of presidential address and commentary, it does act as that galvanizing marching orders for the bureaucracy.
You both made this point, and I think it's a great point to end on. So often we frame the debate between U.S. interests in Europe and U.S. interests in the Asia-Pacific region as in tension with each other, and whether we should be focusing on Europe or focusing on the long-term challenge in the Asia-Pacific region. But what I think I hear both of you saying is handling the problems of security in Europe and then convincing our European partners and allies that they need to take more of a burden post-Ukraine war in containing Russia or in deterring Russia will allow us to shift over the long term to the Asia Pacific region. So yeah. I think that's a great place to end it. Phil and Nick, thank you so much. I've learned a lot today. I've got a couple of ideas for future podcasts, so I really appreciate you being with me today on Chain Reaction. Thanks for tuning in to Chain Reaction, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of FPRI. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hamilton, Head of Eurasia Research at FPRI. Visit us at fpri.org for more on today's topic and many others in the world of foreign policy and national security. Thanks for listening. See you soon.